I'm going to talk a little bit about poverty, and then Stephanie's going to talk a little bit about neighborhood redevelopment. So I get to talk about all the bad stuff, and then she gets to talk about the good things that are happening. So just quickly, Partnership for the Public Good is a community-based think tank, and we do public policy research and advocacy on behalf of 127 community organizations in the Buffalo Niagara area, and urge you to take a look at our website, ppgbuffalo.org, and we have a lot of fact sheets and policy briefs and reports and links and all kinds of information on that. And so everything that I'm going to talk about today is reflected in some of the publications that we have on our website. But I want to talk to you a little bit about who is living in poverty and why, both nationally and in the Buffalo Niagara area. And I want to start by asking you to imagine that the editor of Time magazine wakes up tomorrow morning and realizes that 46 million people in the United States are living in poverty. And this strikes him as a shocking fact, and he decides to do a cover story on it. And so he assembles the team and he tells them, find a typical family living in poverty in America. And so I want you to imagine who you think they're going to put on the cover of Time magazine to be the face of poverty in America, to be typical. So I'm going to ask you some questions about who you think they're going to put on the cover. So first of all, where do you think the family that they put on the cover is going to live? Are they going to live in a rural area, small town, city, or suburbs for the typical family? What do you think? Someone shout it out. Probably the most typical stereotype image of poverty would still be city, right? But in fact, it's now more typical to be living in the suburbs if you're living in poverty. There are now more people living in poverty in the suburbs in the United States than in cities. Or small towns or rural areas. What race do you think the person that they put on the cover or family is going to be? You think it would be white, African American, Hispanic, Asian? The stereotype is a person of color would be the most typical person living in poverty, but it's not even close, actually. Many more people living in poverty are white than are African American. It's about 42% of people living in poverty are white, about 24% black, about 26% Hispanic. How educated is the person that they put on the cover going to be? Do you think college grad, high school grad, or high school dropout? Classic image would be the high school dropout, right? But actually 2/3 of people living in poverty are high school graduates, about 65%. Quite a few of them have been to college. 22% of the people living in poverty in the United States have at least some college education. What do you think the family structure will be? Do you think it'll be a single person, a single mom with kids, a married couple with kids? What do you think is going to be kind of the image of poverty that Time magazine would use?
Single mom with kids.
This would be the one thing they got right, probably, because that is the most typical family structure for people living in poverty, would be the single mom with kids. But it's important to note that's it's the most typical, but it's not the majority. It's about 40% of people living in poverty are in single mom with kids households. About 30% are in married couple households, and then the rest are in single person households or male-headed households. The family size is quite small, and again, there's kind of a stereotype of the big family, people living in poverty, but most people living in poverty are in small families. Only about 1/4 of them are in families of 5 or more. The majority are in families of 1, 2, or 3 people. And lastly, what would the work status be of the typical family living in poverty that would go on Time magazine? Would it be someone who's working or not working, do you think? Not working would be kind of the classic image. But again, Time would be wrong on this one. Most households living in poverty are headed by someone who has worked in the past year. So that if we're really looking for typical, what would be the little life story that we would put on the cover of Time magazine? it would probably be a divorced white woman with 1 or 2 kids, living in the suburbs, and working in a low-wage service sector job, like retail, healthcare, childcare, something like that. Probably not getting enough hours to make it all the way to work 2,000 hours a year to be full-time all year round, but maybe having that many hours, or maybe, you know, in one of these retail jobs where every week they tell you what your hours are and give you different shifts every week and don't give you enough to get by. So that would actually be the most typical. So, you know, try and keep that image in your mind. But the real point is not really to create a new stereotype, it's to emphasize how diverse the poverty population is. That there are many, many people living in poverty in rural areas, in suburbs, and in cities, and in small towns. There are many from every racial demographic. There are many from each family structure, many from different levels of education. And even though we've talked about what's typical, it's also important to remember that absolute numbers and rates are 2 different things. So I want to ask you to have this stereoscopic vision where you remember what's typical, that suburbs is the most common location, but that you also remember that urban people are disproportionately affected by poverty, that African Americans are disproportionately affected, that people with lower levels of education are disproportionately affected. So even though they're not the most in absolute numbers, they do have disproportionately high rates. And when you're thinking about public policy, you really have to remember both of those things simultaneously. You know, if you're devising a successful program, you have to remember that most of your clients are living in the suburbs. But you also have to remember that the most severe need, proportionately, is in the city. So you have to keep both things in mind at the same time. So in Buffalo, it's, you know, a similar story as to who's living in poverty. And what's most surprising, I think, to people who have heard something about Buffalo's poverty is that as a metropolitan region, we're actually right about normal. We're actually a little below normal in terms of our poverty rate. So for the Buffalo-Niagara area, in 2010, our metro poverty rate was 13.8%, and the national rate was 15.1%. So we're actually doing better than average. So why are you always hearing about Buffalo being the 3rd or 4th or 5th poorest city in the country? Because that statistic is about the city of Buffalo itself, the 262,000 people who live inside city limits. There, we are the 3rd or 4th or 5th highest poverty rate in the city. In 2010, the rate was nearly 30%, 29.6% in the city of Buffalo. Similarly, the city of Niagara Falls, 22.8% in 2010. So that's what's unusual about us, it turns out, in the national scene. It's not that we're unusually poor, it's that our poverty is unusually concentrated in the central cities of Buffalo and Niagara Falls. And deep poverty is even more concentrated. So for example, of people who are receiving temporary aid for needy families, TANF, cash welfare for families in need, in 2007, about 3/4 of those families receiving that aid from the county were living in the city of Buffalo. And that gives you kind of a measure of not just living below the poverty line, but living well below the poverty line. That group of people is even more concentrated in the central cities than the poverty population as a whole. We have census tracts in the city of Buffalo. 15 census tracts out of our 80 or some have poverty rates of over 40%. We have 4 census tracts with poverty rates over 50%. The poorest census tract in the city is very close to here. It's right west of City Hall, essentially. That neighborhood, that census tract has a poverty rate of 62.5%. That's the poorest tract in the city. So we're unusual in how concentrated we are, also unusual in how racialized our poverty is, and how racially segregated we are. So the poverty rate for African Americans and Hispanics in Buffalo, Niagara is extraordinarily high, and the geographic concentration of it is very dense. So even if you're a middle income African American person, you have a very high probability of living in an impoverished neighborhood, which has a lot of negative effects on your life chances, on your health, on your education, on your job opportunities. in our metro area, about 80% of African Americans are living in high poverty neighborhoods, compared to only about 10% of whites. About 60% of Hispanics are living in these very high poverty neighborhoods. So when we think about Buffalo's poverty, we've got to remember, both what's typical, but also these disparities and these disproportions and this segregation. I want to give you 3 frameworks for thinking about poverty and solutions to it. The individual, the group level, and the level of society. So the individual level, this works best for someone who you're trying to keep out of poverty at an individual level, or someone who's already in poverty and you're trying to help them to get out. So imagine that you're giving advice to your high school age student, and you want to give them advice for staying out of poverty. So what would some tips be to an individual to stay out of poverty? What would be some of the key things you would want to do to avoid poverty? Give me an idea. Education would be the first advice probably to give, because the higher you go on the education scale, the lower your chances of ending up in poverty. As we heard, there are a lot of people in poverty who have some college, but nonetheless, graduating high school dramatically increases your chances of not living in poverty. Graduating college again, and so on up the line. So get an education. What else might you advise someone for staying out of poverty at an individual level? Don't get in debt would be a really important piece of advice. Don't start maxing out those credit cards because debt is a trap that keeps you in poverty, especially given the explosion in the last couple of decades of very high interest rate, very exploitative forms of debt being offered to people with low incomes, whether it's rent-a-center stores, pawn shops, payday loans, auto title loans, subprime mortgages, home equity loans, all different kinds of ways to get in trouble. What other advice might you give an individual?
It's too late if they're teenagers, but find the right parents.
Find the right parents. So yeah, your family structure and the parenting that you receive is going to be crucial.
Getting married, aren't people who are married less likely to be in poverty?
Being in a 2-income household, especially in the United States. If you're in Sweden and you're a single mom, your chance of living in poverty is about 5%. If you're in the United States and you're a single mom, your chance of living in poverty is about 40%. So particularly in this country, delaying childbearing and, if possible, waiting until you have a 2-parent family of whatever kind, or 2-adult family, 2 wage earners in the household would be crucial. So lots of good advice about an individual staying out of poverty. But then, what happens if your high school age kid says, well, okay, I understand that, but explain to me why some groups in our society are living in poverty at a much higher rate than others. That can't be just like individual choices. There have to be some group factors. And so then you'd have to get into why do some groups do better than others, and then you would have to get into the whole history of inequality in our country by race, by gender, by class, by geography, by disability, and all the different ways that our social structure and our policies and politics have kept some groups down and given them advantages and disadvantages. And one of the most dramatic examples I can give you of this is a study that has been done several times in several different ways by researchers, where they create fictitious resumes and they give half of the resumes African-American sounding names and half of them white sounding names. And then they send them to employers and they see how many callbacks you get. And they found that if you just give an identical resume an African-American sounding name, the callback rate goes dramatically down. In one of the studies that was done, they gave some of the applicants, fictitious applicants, felony records and some no criminal background. A white name with a felony record was more likely to get a callback than an African-American sounding name with no callback, with no criminal record. So just one example of the different levels of discrimination and inequality that we have in our country. So that helps us understand why some groups do better than others. But then, what if we're trying to understand why does the poverty rate as a whole go up and down over time? Why do some countries have much lower poverty rates than us? What are the choices we're making as a society? Why is it that the child poverty rate in Norway is about 3%, and in the United States it's about 20%? They have a very similar economy in Norway, so what different choices are they making, not as individuals, but as a society? So the way I like to dramatize this point for you is, and apologies to those who have heard the apple analogy before, but imagine that there are 100 of you, and that you're all extremely hungry because you haven't had lunch before coming to the Ring of Knowledge, and that I have 90 apples here, and that I say, okay, lunchtime, and I throw the apples here into the actual ring, and then you scramble for them. But there are 100 of you and there are only 90 apples. So 10 of you don't get them. So let's imagine it's the 10 of you in the back. So how do I explain your failure to get the apples? So I could do it at the individual level, the group level, or the society level. So if I do it at the individual level, I'm going to analyze each of your situations and come up with some reasons. So I'm going to I'm going to work on your speed training. I'm going to say you need to learn to run faster. And I'm going to say, you need alertness, so we're going to medicate you. We're going to give you some Ritalin, and you're going to, leap up when I dump the apples. And, I could come up with these individual responses for each of you. But then what if one of you points out, yeah, but why is it all of us in the back that seem to have these individual issues? Isn't there something about us as a group? Well, yes, there is. You're sitting in the back. So there's a group explanation. So I could solve that. I could move you all to the front. And then you wouldn't have that problem, and you would all get the apples. But then someone else might say, but there's still only 90 apples and 100 of us. So all we've done so far is affect who gets the apples, not how many apples. So what would solutions be for all of you to get fed? Any ideas?
Make applesauce.
Make applesauce.
Just cut 'em up.
Cut them up. So either I could somehow generate 100 apples, or you could each get 9/10 of an apple or a 9/10 serving of applesauce, and everyone would have food. So that's the social level, that's the public policy social level that talks about not just who gets resources, but how many resources there are available. So now just think of that in terms of well-paying jobs. How many well-paying jobs are there? They're not enough to go around. And to bring that to the level of Buffalo, we did a count a couple of years ago where we just looked at the Bureau of Labor Statistics for some of the most common low-paying jobs, and it was amazing how many there were in these different categories. So, for example, over 50,000 jobs in food prep and serving, where the median wage is $17,300 a year. Over 20,000 jobs in retail salesperson, 18,000 jobs cashier, 12,000 janitor cleaner, 9,000 teacher's assistant, 8,500 nursing aides orderlies. All jobs where the median wage is $26,000 a year or less. It's about a third of the jobs in our metro economy are these low-paying, almost all service sector jobs. We just don't have enough good jobs to go around, and if we're going to deal with that, then we have to deal with job creation, but even more fundamentally, we have to do with wages. What are people getting paid? So, in terms of policy solutions and thinking about poverty, I want to suggest that it's not as mysterious as it sometimes seems. And that's partly because so often when we think about poverty, we're thinking about it at that individual level. And we're thinking about, well, this person is poor because they have a drug addiction. And this person is poor because they didn't get enough education. And we're thinking about these sort of individual solutions, and it sounds very overwhelming. But at the public policy level, in a way, it's a lot simpler. People are living in poverty because their income is too low and their expenses are too high. Some combination of those two things. So poverty solutions are about raising incomes and reducing expenses. So on the raising income side, that starts with wages. It starts with policies like minimum wage. There was a minimum wage bill in the New York Assembly and Senate last year. Passed the Assembly but not the Senate. It'll be back this year. That's one of the ways you raise wages. Living wage policies, where local governments say, we can't change the minimum wage, but we're only going to do business with companies that pay a living wage, and that's typically set at enough to keep a family out of poverty, quite a bit more than a minimum wage. Anything that helps workers organize, unionize, and gain power is going to tend to drive wage rates up. So there are a lot of policies that have effect on wages, and there are a lot of policies that have effect on expenses. If you think about what are people's big, everyday expenses that are draining money from their coffers and keeping them in poverty, you're thinking about food, you're thinking about housing, you're thinking about medical care, you're thinking about education, transportation. So, heat. Thank you. What can we do, especially in Buffalo, where rents are deceptively low and utility bills are deceptively high? So we're often known for our affordable housing, but once you factor in utility bills, our housing is not so affordable. And about 75% of renters in this area pay their own utilities, so they're bearing that cost directly. So what are public policies that lower some of those expenses? Cheaper public transportation, public and subsidized housing, food stamps, affordable medical care. So none of these is rocket scientist or rocket science. Even for people who can't say rocket science correctly and say rocket scientists, they can understand some of these solutions. Just to bring it back to Buffalo and kind of set the stage for Stephanie, we talked about the fact that what's unusual is the concentration of poverty in the central city. What makes that even more dramatic and striking and visible and problematic is that that's combined with population loss. And again, I think you really need stereoscopic vision. So you need to keep our concentration of poverty in mind and our population loss in mind, and remember that they're two separate but related things. So when you drive around a neighborhood like Broadway Fillmore and you see that incredible amount of vacant lots and abandoned housing, you are seeing poverty, but you're also just seeing population loss. And those are two different but related things. And you know, sometimes it makes our poverty seem even worse than it is, that we also have the population loss. But we have to recognize that population loss is a problem when we're talking about fighting poverty too. And then we need strategies that really deal with both, and that take a holistic approach to redeveloping neighborhoods. Because in Buffalo, if you just sprinkle some housing assistance here and some housing assistance there throughout the city, it's going to be very difficult to have success because you still have depopulation. People are still leaving these neighborhoods. So you can heavily subsidize someone to own a home in Broadway Fillmore, and you could put $150,000 into building or renovating that home, and then maybe charge them a much less amount for it, and you'll have done them a big favor in some ways. But the problem is, what happens 10 years from now? What's that house worth when they go to sell it? So you have to think about how can we take blocks and redevelop them in a very holistic way that helps the neighborhood and the residents who live there. And one group that does exactly that is Heart of the City Neighborhoods. So I'll turn it over to Stephanie.
You're a tall person, so I need to bring this down. Thank you. First, I want to say thank you to Beth for allowing me to talk to folks. I see some familiar faces out there, so as Sam said, if I'm saying the same things that you've heard me say before, you can doodle on your iPads and such. But I'm Stephanie Simeon. I'm the Executive Director of Heart of the City Neighborhoods, and I have the unique pleasure of providing affordable housing in the Lower West Side. For those of you who are more familiar with zip codes, that's 14201 and 14202. And my passions as an urban planner, my passions as a person who lived in Brooklyn, New York, and being able to work in a place that I love in Buffalo, New York. One of the things that I'm going to be talking to you about is, if you know the song, if you can't have the one you want, love the one you're with. So if we can't have the city and the neighborhoods that we want, we need to love what we have. And I will be giving you some techniques that you can take back to your own communities and think about ways that you can redevelop and deal with some of the startling facts that Sam shared about poverty. So I wanted to start with this quote that I thought was really interesting. It says the test of progress is not whether we add to the abundance of those who have much. It is whether we provide enough to those who have little. And that's by former President Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And when she gave that analogy about the apples, that was one of the issues, which is, have we done enough? Have we done enough by just giving out the 90 apples, knowing good and well that there's 100 people here that needs to eat? So the good thing of having Sam go first, because he gave all those really tough numbers, and he kind of set the framework as for what are we dealing with in Buffalo. I have the unique opportunity to deal with affordable housing, and so safe affordable housing is a basic necessity for every family. I want to make sure that people understand that affordable housing is not just based upon those folks who are benefiting or folks who are on social services, folks who are low income, folks who are impoverished. We all have the rights. We all should have affordable housing and a safe, clean neighborhood. We should all have access to a quality living environment, and affordable housing should just be the side effect. You should be in the neighborhood that you want to be in and just happen to live in a home that you can afford. It becomes an issue, and Sam and I had talked about this, of poverty and it's a fact versus reality. Because if you ask the average person who actually lives in the communities that we talked about that are impoverished, they will not think that they're living in poverty. Because people who live in these neighborhoods and are living in these communities, they make do. Again, if you can't have the one you want, you love the one that you're with. So what are families doing who are living in these situations where there is a single head of household only making $26,000 a year? For some people, that would be considered a higher income, because that's a good paying job. It's $10 an hour. If you don't know what you don't know, this seems to be a good thing. So what do those families look like? They happen to have maybe the grandma, maybe the aunt who is unable to work. She lives in a home as well. She's providing daycare so that mom who is making the $26,000 a year can go out, make her living, and know that her kids are being taken care of. There are other resources out there that can make up that income where you may say, I am not actually living in poverty, because if you think about the cost that I'm saving by having my aunt or my mom take care of my child, if you think about the fact that we have someone helping us pay the rent, we have more than one income coming in helping us pay the rent, people start to look at what physically is poverty. We all have a duty to our community, to our neighbors, to make sure that if we have those type of families pulling together resources, that they are pulling together resources in a home that is not substandard housing. We know that in Buffalo, given the age of the housing stock, average age being 1840, meaning that our homes are very old, we are exposing many of these families who already have issues with health, who are already having limited resources, to issues of lead. We understand and we see, for those of you who are in the group who are teachers, the side effects of living in a home with high lead risk, which is children who are constantly being diagnosed as being learning disabled, children with high anger issues. These are not just things that come out of nowhere. These are not just issues isolated to one specific racial group. This is because people, when they leave your classroom and when they leave the environments that you provide for them, they're going into toxic environments. So when you want to say, why is it that why is this particular group not succeeding? Why couldn't they get to the back of the room and get these apples? Well, you might want to figure out, when they're not with you, where are they? So one of the opportunities that we're able to do, and not just at Heart of the City, but housing organizations Buffalo-wide, are looking at sustainable housing, and looking at green and healthy homes approach. And we're looking at asbestos, and we're looking at lead, we're looking at mold. We're looking at simple things just as pests. How can we build these homes, rehab these homes to deal with pest issues? Another thing that you want to talk about is not only just the poverty, but what does that do to a person's or a child's social impact? They feel like they can't invite their friends over for a sleepover because they're embarrassed at where they're living. When you feel embarrassed about your own neighborhood, that also is affecting your health. So we have a lot of folks that say in certain groups are high obesity, high asthma, diabetes, and all these issues. Well, if you had a community that you can walk in and not get shot, if you had a community that you can walk in and feel safe, you wouldn't have some of these issues that you see that are more apparent in communities of color or communities that are largely based upon the incomes that they're able to bring in. So again, if you can't have the one you want, love the one you with. How can you look at the community that you're in, look at the assets, look at it as a asset as opposed to what is it that you don't have. Empower yourselves as residents, empower your community. If you are a block club leader, what can you do to say that this is not acceptable? What can we do to build our community to make it stronger, to give us a quality of life? So you may have a community where everyone is making, not making enough to make ends meet, but what can you do? So if you are living in a neighborhood that is surrounded by vacant housing, if you are in a neighborhood that you do not have access to food, your closest grocery store is a bodega. If you are living in a community where you have to take 2 buses or a train or get a ride or a taxi cab so that you can get access to clean food, or you're busing your kids to another community because they have no access to proper education, then you are living in an impoverished neighborhood. And I don't think there's anyone in here that can say that they don't have proximity to that. I also think we need to know that just in case if that's an issue across the street from you, if that issue is not fixed in your neighborhood, it can spread. The one fun thing about poverty is that it spreads. So if you think that's an East Side issue or that's a West Side issue or that doesn't happen in North Buffalo, if we don't fix it in the other areas where it's happening, all that's going to do is just move people from one place to another, people with a lack of resources and unable to get to what they need, and they're just going to be in one place and still not being able to get that. So, back to what I said, what can we do? One of the things that we have looked at is the vacant housing issue. One of the challenges that abandoned and dilapidated housing in Buffalo not only pose a physical threat of collapsing, they also can also be targeted for arsonists, hideouts for squatters, drug dealers, and addicts. This is not an issue in one particular area in Buffalo. We see that all over. Where do people go if they don't have a home? If we're not dealing with the homeless issue and there's vacant housing, where do you think people are going? Where do you think people who want to do illicit activity, they want to hide, they want to be in places that are not well lit, they go, any of you who watch The Wire or watch that show understand that what happens to folks that want to use a space, they use them as a drug warehouse. We did a needle cleanup in one of the vacant homes that we're getting ready to rehab on Prospect Avenue. We had about 5 bags full of needles, and the places that were supposed to do the needle drop off could not actually handle the capacity of needles. That was just from one property that we're actually getting ready to gut and rehab. What that shows is not just, what people are doing or what they're using to deal with reality. Reality can be tough, especially when you don't have a lot of resources. What people turn to make them be able to cope. And where they're doing it in these vacant houses. You do not want your kids walking down that street where there's a bunch of vacant housing. It's not safe because this row of vacant housing is not only is it not safe for you to get in your own neighborhood, but these homes are probably ridden with lead poison, the asbestos issue, and then when they get demolished, that doesn't mean that your situation has been solved. You've demolished a vacant property. Now you have what some people will call an urban prairie. You have one house and you have a series of vacancies. That just continues on neglect. So what can you do about the vacant housing issue? What can you do about if you're left with a vacant lot? What can you do if you see that your neighbor or your community is not getting the resources that it needs? One of the things that I suggest that you strongly do as a community, you don't have to take the vacant housing issue. It doesn't have to be an issue that you're waiting for an organization like Heart of the City or Push or Flair or any other groups. You don't need to wait for a company to come in and fix your neighborhood. You need to be empowered to understand what it is you need. So there's a different way to look at vacancy. We talked about maybe using decorative panels, which is having and engaging the youth to paint plywood and cover up the vacancy. Another thing that we've done at Heart of the City and that you can do is that if you know that your neighbor is losing their home or getting evicted, you can actually ask the landlord and have them put up curtains to make the property make it look like it's lived in as opposed to having it vacant. You all know what is vacant. because you live there, but it doesn't have to look that way. So you don't have to have boarded up homes. If that is something that is considered an eyesore, you can put curtains in the windows, really cheap. You can just put fabric up to make it look like someone's lived in. There's techniques that you can do if there happens to be electricity on at the property, which is setting up a timer on the lamps so it looks like at a certain time during the day that the lights are going on. Keeping and holding landlords accountable, making sure that they are mowing the grass. High weeds and grass bring rats and also all their friends to your place. And those things exacerbate issues of asthma, allergies, and so on and so forth. So if you think that is an issue that you don't have to deal with, you do. So if it's a city-owned lot, take the city to task. Make sure that they are keeping those lots mowed and clean. If they're not, 311 it. I would tell you, if you have the opportunity to do it and do it yourself, great, but that's not what we need to be doing. You also need to be watching those lots, making sure that you know what's going on. You should know your neighborhood well enough that if there's something going on that doesn't seem kosher to you, call 911. Another thing that you can do is with Grassroots Gardens of Buffalo, you can contact them to see if you have enough neighbors that are interested in doing a community garden. Those beautification projects actually really do mean a lot. There's studies that show that people united in that kind of front can reduce crime at a significant rate, because no one wants to do crime when they see a bunch of people getting together doing something, especially if you have gardening tools in your hand. They know they can't mess with you. So that's another way to keep folks engaged, to know your community. Another way to deal with the vacant housing issue, if you can't get plugged into a housing organization that's willing to look at the property, see if it can be rehabbed, similar to the work that we're doing. If it needs to be demolished, there's other treatments that can be done on that land, and that's stuff that we can talk about a little bit later on. Know your community, know your block clubs, and stick with them, because I think we've gone away from knowing who our neighbors are, and we're saying that's somebody else's issue. But you need to know who's in your neighborhood. You need to be able to take care of each other, and you can actually be proactive. You know when a house is going to be vacant. You've talked to your neighbors at the grocery store, and they say, "Listen, we're moving out of here. We're going to this neighborhood." Figure out what they're going to do about that property to make sure it's just not sitting there and vacant. What can you do to support other people to make sure that if you don't have the resources, how you can get it? If you don't have access to food, people go where there's money, and you can vote with your feet. So what can you do to make sure that if there's another business coming into the neighborhood, you should be able to talk to the powers that be and say, listen, instead of putting something that's only going to last a year, we need a grocery store in this neighborhood. We have no place to get fresh food. That's not a luxury. It's a basic human need. This is what we need. That's another way to deal with areas like you talked about, Broadway, Fillmore, where there's huge areas of vacancy. Well, what can you do with those vacant commercial corridors? You can fill those in with things that you need. You need grocery stores, you need a place to do your banking, you need all that stuff. That's what you need to be advocating for, and not necessarily saying, well, we don't have this and we don't have that. You don't have that because you're not advocating for yourself and saying, this is what we demand, this is what we need. If you look at your neighbors to the west and look at what's been going on the west side, what happened and what is causing that movement is people got fed up. People started saying, we're having these issues of gangs, this crime. What are we going to do about this? People started talking with their neighbors. People started getting more engaged. That empowered organizations like Heart of the City and Push to be invigorated to go after the state funding and other public dollars to bring in the kind of development dollars that's turning that neighborhood around. That doesn't mean that can't happen east. That doesn't mean that cannot happen south. You just have to be engaged enough to say, this is not acceptable. You can always turn to your nonprofits, that's what we're here for, but this takes a movement that has to happen with you saying this is not acceptable. If you happen to live in a community that is benefiting from a stabilized community, make sure you understand that if it's not stable and in the west or the east of you, that's still a problem, so you still should be engaged about that. One of the things that I want to make sure that we left with today is that affordable housing, that's what I do. but people think there's affordable housing all over Buffalo. Just because the rent is $350 a month, that doesn't mean it's affordable. Your home is affordable if you have a decent quality of life, that you don't have rats and roaches, that you have a responsible landlord, that you have running water, electricity, and these are real issues. The census tract that Sam talked about, west of here, that's my census tract. That's the area that I serve. That's the neighborhood that I will continue to be in and wanting to do this work so that we don't have these issues. But access to water, you would be surprised how many folks do not have running water, do not have electricity. If you see someone stealing the electricity from somebody else, yes, that is an issue, but you really need to get to the bottom of why isn't this person able to have electricity on their own? What is happening with that unit where they don't have that? We still have a significant issue of people reworking the water lines because they don't have water, they don't have heat. If 70% of our people are using their income on utilities, then what leaves them the money extra to take care of healthcare, to have proper food? When you're thinking about where your money is going, if it's going to all those things, that means something else is going behind. So if you want to say, well, you know, what's going on with our kids? They're not paying attention in school. They're not doing this. Well, if they can't eat because their parents are using their money for other things, what do you think is going to happen? So back to my saying of if you don't have what you have, love the one that you're with. These communities aren't broken. Buffalo isn't broken. We have a lot of work to do. I think having these discussions and having these open dialogues will keep things going. Knowing what your resources are on this, one of the rings of knowledge there. I have a bunch of pamphlets out there, even a coloring book, teaching your kids on how to save electricity. Again, if you can reduce those utility costs and have more money in your home so that you can have a decent place to live, that's the goal here. I do have some flyers out there about the lead, and one pamphlet I have out there is about greening your home. A lot of the things that you can do yourself is actually different ways to clean your home that can reduce pests, that can reduce allergens. A lot of the lead issues that you're seeing, if you can clean your door sashes, your window sashes and your doors, simple things like that, that can reduce your risk. So that's there. Certain plants to grow to get the lead out of your soil. So if you are doing a community garden or you're growing your own vegetables, things that you can plant to get those toxins out of the soil if you are not able to afford a raised bed. All of those pamphlets are out there for you. I am here as a resource, even though I'm in 14201 and 14202. If you need anything from me, if I'm able to connect you to a resource, I would be willing to do that. And so that's all I have. Thank you.
Do we have any questions for Stephanie or Sam?
Sam and Stephanie, thank you. I enjoyed it very much. The question I have, either one of you may be able to answer that. Sam, you know, in the health world, I can measure the impact of poor health economically. Have we done that here at all in Buffalo, or are you aware of any studies that they've measured the impact of poverty on our communities economically in a sense?
I'll let you go.
I don't think we have a good study like that. For Buffalo, there are definitely quite a few national studies that try and do that. And sometimes it's framed as sort of making the business case for anti-poverty strategies. Canada has done a lot of work around that. But I have a couple of studies in my office that do that for the nation that say by spending X amount on anti-poverty strategies, we will save, 10 times that amount. So I've seen that nationally, but I've never seen that for Buffalo.
Only thing that I've seen is sort of in the housing world. If you make X amount of investments, this is what you can see for the neighborhood. I think that was whatever research was done to create the mayor's 5 and 5 plan, 5,000 demos in 5 years. I'm pretty sure that's where the research came from, so that they can have a reason for doing that kind of work.
Just mention also the Homeless Alliance of Western New York's latest plan for ending homelessness, which is called Opening Doors, I think, has some information about the cost impact of using the Housing First model to end chronic homelessness. citing some studies from around the country and also giving some local statistics on that particular piece of it, why it's so much cheaper to house people than to leave them homeless, and all the money that you save on emergency room visits, detox, other social services by giving people stable housing immediately rather than trying to process them through a system of shelter and then transitional housing and then permanent housing. The Housing First model says if we can get people right into permanent housing, we end up saving a lot of money. It's much cheaper than shelter or transitional housing with all the other costs that go along with it.
Hi.
Oh, sorry. The mic's up here.
Hi, my friends. To answer your question, I live on the street that Stephanie was describing about the air quality in that, the studies. I live near the Peace Bridge, and there are studies, and there have been studies in that area because there's very poor air quality there, and evidence that it increases the asthma and other problems in that area. I keep an eye on that because I live there, and I have similar health problems. I didn't know, I live on the street that you were talking about, and I did not know that my area was 62% in poverty. But when I'm sitting here thinking about it, because most of my neighbors walk, we have very few cars in that neighborhood, most people walk. Luckily we have a store right there, we have Tops, so people, all of us, go to Tops, come back, and a lot of the people that live on the street work at Tops. But we also have unemployment. Another thing is that you didn't mention was, well, when you were saying about making it love what you have, I was born and raised in one of the largest cities in the world. So when I moved to Buffalo, I was looking for a neighborhood that had a high residence, the community that had a high residence of all cultures and all nationalities, because that's how I grew up. That's where I feel the most comfortable. So on that street, that's what I have it right there in the Lower West Side. But one of the things in my neighborhood, we have wonderful gardens, and you mentioned vegetables. We have flower gardens there, and the people that live there, for all of my neighbors, we all grow flowers. And so when you walk, I was talking to someone the other day, and I told him where I lived. He says, I love that street. I walk down there in the summer. I love walking down there looking at the flowers. So yes, we might be 62% low income, but we love our flowers on that street. And I didn't realize that there could be that many at the house that you demolished, that there's that much activity in that house. I know that house quite well. But the neighbors are there. Buffalo is the city of good neighbors. I can attest to that. Beautiful people in my neighborhood, even if we are low income, beautiful people. So thank you for your comments. Thank you.
Okay.
While the mic is going back there, I'll just mention that the really simple vacant lot treatments is something that we're really urging the city to adopt a strategy for. And there's a great model from Philadelphia called Philadelphia Clean and Green, where you just plant grass, keep it mowed, and you put just a really simple fence, wood rail fence in front of the lot to show that it's cared for, to show that this is turned the corner from being an eyesore to an asset. And we think that's one of the low-cost strategies that can really make a difference in Buffalo. Particularly if you do what they do in Philadelphia, you then hire disadvantaged youth to clean up those lots. Yeah, sir.
Yeah, I came here because of the redevelopment, and there's a big project going on, redevelopment on Main Street. They're putting 210 parking spaces. It's $50 million, and they're going to take away the theater train station, to poor people, which I happen to be one. And I just wonder, I don't hear any of you all's crying about this ridiculous operation. That's all. I just wonder why nobody's saying anything.
Can you clarify? It's a 200. What's happening?
They're putting 210 parking spaces. They want to put cars on Main Street. They're going to spend $50 million to do this, and if they want, but they're going to take away that train station at the theater, and people use that.
Yeah.
And I don't understand why nobody's saying anything.
Well, I'll tell you one group that is protesting that, that's one of our partner organizations, is Citizens for Regional Transit Corporation. So I definitely recommend, if that's an issue that you care about, that you get in touch with them. Citizens for Regional Transit Corporation, and they have been protesting that, and they like it. They're like you. They agree that it's better the way it is with the transit stop still there.
I'm very impressed by your speech, Sam. You should run for politics. What that gentleman was talking about, they're going to redo it at a cost of $13 million. They're starting it right now. They're going to put traffic back on Main Street using stoplights, and they're getting rid of the 2 stations, and the next one will be down. Now, can you imagine on a Friday night when people are exiting and entering Chippewa Street, and trains are coming down to Chippewa, somebody who has been partying with Jack Daniels attempting to negotiate that 1,000-foot stretch with a car. Very dangerous. I lived on Fillmore Avenue. Now, if you're impressed by facts, in the 2010 census, that lost 2,200 people. And to address their situation, that's a Stephen Stills song from 1970, December, called Love the One You're With. My question is, you hear a lot of rhetoric from politicians and stuff like that about investing money in areas like that, but it doesn't come true. Now, I lived there at a rooming house for 17 months. So this is one white boy that saw things firsthand. And several things. Knowledge is power. When you get rid of midnight basketball, which keeps kids off the street,